What are you hearing from consumers when they come in here?
Prices too high. Car prices seem to have been rising ever since COVID, and there's no turning back on that.
On April 15th, 2022, something happened that changed trucking in America forever. While most people were asking, will the truck market crash? The real answer was much darker. It already crashed on that exact date. On that single day, hundreds of thousands of truck drivers started losing everything. Companies that made millions of dollars during the good times disappeared overnight. Trucking companies went from making huge profits to losing money on every single load. The math became deadly simple. It costs $2.26 to run a truck for 1 mile, but drivers only get paid $1.60 per mile. That means every mile a truck drives, the owner loses money. Small trucking companies are closing down every single month. But here's the real mystery. Some big companies are making record profits while others are completely falling apart. Stay till the end, because the companies making millions have discovered something that could either save or destroy every single trucker in America. To understand how badly the truck market crashed, you need to understand how incredibly high it went before the fall. In 2021 and early 2022, the trucking industry experienced something it had never seen before. It was like hitting the lottery every single week. During the pandemic, something unexpected happened. People stopped buying services like eating at restaurants and going to movies. Instead, they spent all their money buying things: clothes, furniture, electronics, everything. Stores ran out of products because they could not keep up with demand. Every retailer in America was desperately understocked and needed freight moved immediately to their stores. The pay rates for moving one load of freight reached over $3 per mile. Think about what that meant for a truck driver working 70 hours every single week. For a small trucking company or a person who owned their own truck, it was like finding free money on the street every single day. Hundreds of thousands of people rushed into the trucking industry during this period. They bought brand new trucks, formed companies, and invested their entire life savings because they believed this incredible boom would last forever. They thought the good times would never end. Truck dealerships were booming. New trucks were selling faster than they could be manufactured. The entire industry was adding more trucks and more capacity at a rate that had not been seen in decades. Everything felt permanent. Banks were eager to loan money. Equipment companies were hiring frantically. Everyone wanted a piece of the trucking gold rush. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The boom itself contained the seeds of its own destruction. Every high pay rate attracted new truck companies. Every new company added more trucks to the market, but all those trucks were not actually needed. They were built on the dangerous assumption that the boom would continue forever. As more and more trucks flooded the market in 2022, the conditions for collapse were quietly forming underneath all that confidence and prosperity. Nobody saw the crash coming because everyone believed the gold rush would last. They could not imagine any other possibility. Then, in April 2022, everything was about to change forever. April 2022 is the exact moment that changed everything for truckers across America. The post-pandemic shopping frenzy did not end gradually like most people expected. It ended almost overnight. Something changed in people's spending habits. Consumer spending suddenly rotated from buying products back to buying services like going to restaurants, traveling, and entertainment. Retailers who had been desperately understocked during the pandemic finally worked off their huge inventory surpluses. All those products that needed to be moved had finally been delivered. The massive backlog of freight that had piled up during COVID started to disappear. Suddenly, shippers had options for the first time in 2 years. They did not have to pay $3 per mile anymore. They could wait, they could negotiate, they could shop around for better prices. The supply and demand equation completely flipped in just a matter of weeks. Suddenly, there were too many trucks and not enough freight to fill all those trucks. Think about being a truck driver in April 2022, making $3 per mile and watching those rates drop week after week. The growing fear as you realize the gold rush is over and you do not know what comes next. As April 2022 turned into May, June, and July, the pay rates kept falling. Truck companies began realizing they had a serious problem. The real devastation came from the brutal math that would destroy hundreds of thousands of trucking operations. Spot rates fell from over $3 per mile to around $1.60 to $1.80 per mile through 2023 and 2024. That was a devastating 45% decline in pay for every trucker in America. But at the exact same time, the cost to operate a truck went in the opposite direction. Fuel prices remained high, maintenance costs climbed every single month, labor costs rose, insurance costs absolutely exploded. By the first quarter of 2026, the American Transportation Research Institute calculated that the average cost to operate a truck had reached $2.26 per mile. The non-fuel costs alone hit a record $1.78 per mile. Now imagine the brutal math of operating a truck in this market. You are getting paid $1.70 per mile for hauling freight, but your cost to operate is $2.26 per mile. You are losing 56 cents on every single mile you drive. Every load you haul means money lost. Every day you operate means going bankrupt. Think about a business where your income is falling 45% while your costs are rising 51% at the same time. These costs were not optional. Fuel was real, maintenance was necessary, labor had to be paid, insurance was required by law. These were structural costs that could not be cut. As carriers realized the math of their situation, panic turned to desperation. Either rates had to rise dramatically or carriers had to go bankrupt. Rates did not recover, so carriers failed in massive numbers. Between 2023 and 2025, something unprecedented happened in the trucking industry. Small carriers and owner-operators began exiting the market at historically high rates, unlike anything seen in decades. They were not just failing in the normal sense. They were having their operating authority completely revoked by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Operating authority is an official license to do business. When you lose it, you are done. You cannot operate legally anymore. Hundreds of thousands of owner-operators and small fleet operators simply gave up. They could not make the math work anymore. Imagine being an owner-operator who bought a truck during the boom and invested your life savings into building a business. You had dreams, you had plans, and then you watched it all die because you could not survive on $1.60 to $1.80 per mile rates when your costs were $2.26 per mile. Imagine having to surrender your license and start over with nothing. These carriers that exited were not incompetent or poorly run. They were destroyed by mathematics. Rates did not support viable operations. Costs exceeded revenue. The industry map was being completely redrawn through the elimination of small competitors. But the destruction did not stop with truck companies. The carrier failures spread like a wave through the entire trucking ecosystem. Truck dealerships had scaled their businesses on the dangerous assumption that the 2021 to 2022 boom was the new normal. They had hired salespeople, expanded facilities, and increased inventory because they expected years of strong sales. Instead, sales plummeted like a rock. Commercial truck sales fell 13.6% in 2025 alone. Class 8 heavy-duty truck sales hit devastating monthly lows. November 2025 was the worst month, with only 12,479 units sold. That was the weakest performance since May 2020 during the depths of COVID. Dealerships that had been booming were suddenly struggling to survive. The same pattern spread to logistics technology, freight tech startups, and supply chain companies. Tech startups that had raised millions of dollars on the assumption of continued growth suddenly faced shutdown. Imagine being a truck dealership manager who had hired people and promised them job security, then having to lay them off as your business nearly collapsed. The twist is that these dealerships and tech companies were not directly responsible for the freight recession. They were just caught in the wave of a market correction. They had done everything right. They had expanded during the boom. They had invested in growth. But timing is destiny in business, and their timing turned out to be terrible. But in late 2025, something unexpected began to happen that gave legitimate truckers their first ray of hope in years. Federal regulators launched a massive crackdown on illegal truck drivers, carriers, and commercial driving schools across the country. The goal was simple: remove illegally operating capacity from the market. And it actually worked. As non-compliant operators were shut down and illegal capacity was removed, the available supply of trucks tightened for the first time since April 2022. supply finally tightened faster than demand was falling. Spot rates began creeping upward from their devastating lows. Slowly, they moved from $1.60 to $1.80 per mile to $1.80 to $2 per mile. It was not a full recovery, but it was the beginning of a possible recovery. Think about being a legitimate carrier who had been operating at a loss for years while watching illegal carriers undercut you even further. The relief of slightly higher rates and fair competition was enormous. The regulatory crackdown was not intended as a recovery mechanism for the trucking market. Regulators were just enforcing rules and shutting down illegal operators. But the side effect was positive for compliant carriers. It was the first good news they had heard in 4 years. Unfair competition had been driving down prices, and removing those illegal competitors finally gave legitimate truckers some breathing room. In early 2026, the biggest trucking company in America reported something remarkable. J.B. Hunt, the largest trucking company in the United States, reported a 20% profit increase in their Q1 2026 earnings compared to the previous year. J.B. Hunt and other large carriers were finally benefiting from tighter capacity and improved demand, while their smaller competitors who could not survive had already exited the market. If the biggest trucking company in America were making profits again, the market might actually be recovering. This was the first real evidence that the crash had ended and recovery was beginning. Large carriers that had the money to survive the storm were now reaping the benefits of less competition. The thousands of smaller companies that were eliminated had handed the survivors much more of the available load volume. The market was slowly healing, but only for those who had survived the devastating years. The survivors were battle-hardened, efficient, and ready to capitalize on any opportunity. As 2026 progressed and spot rates continued moving upward, another critical challenge hit the industry. In 2025, the government imposed 25% tariffs on foreign content in medium and heavy-duty trucks under an industrial policy. These were not small fees. They were massive duties that pushed the purchase price of new equipment sharply higher. A truck that cost $150,000 in 2024 suddenly cost $160,000 to $165,000 after tariffs in 2025. For a carrier already struggling with negative margins on freight, the thought of buying a new truck became completely impossible. Equipment prices spiked across the board. Demand for new trucks fell even further. The tariffs created a reason to delay buying equipment, which made the market much worse. The timing could not have been worse. Expensive tariffs came during the worst equipment market in years. But the twist is that these tariffs were supposed to protect domestic truck manufacturing. Instead, they reduced demand for trucks completely. Fewer trucks were sold overall. Domestic manufacturers were hurt. Carriers were hurt. The policy completely backfired. It was a well-intentioned policy that had the opposite effect of what was intended. But in late 2025 and early 2026, something unexpected gave the industry hope. In autumn 2026, something is coming that could completely restart the dead truck market. The EPA 2027 emissions regulations are about to take effect. These are new government rules that will require the cleanest diesel engines ever mandated in American trucking. When new emissions rules are created, carriers rush to buy equipment before the stricter standards take effect. This happened predictably in 2009 and 2019 when previous emissions regulations triggered major equipment purchasing waves. History shows us exactly what happens. It is expected to happen again in late 2026 and early 2027. Imagine being a carrier who has not been able to buy new trucks for 4 years because of the freight recession. Your trucks are aging, maintenance costs are rising, but you could not justify buying a new truck when you were losing money on every load. Now, the EPA 2027 regulations are creating a reason to finally upgrade before the deadline hits. ACT Research, an industry research company, noted in April 2026 that the Class 8 truck market has entered a more constructive phase with stronger order activity, improving freight fundamentals, tighter capacity, and increased urgency ahead of EPA 2027 regulations. As autumn 2026 approaches and the EPA deadline becomes more real, anticipation is building throughout the industry. The structural picture of what really happened to trucking is finally becoming crystal clear. The truck market spent 3 years systematically grinding its most vulnerable participants into complete insolvency. The freight recession eliminated small carriers, owner-operators, and marginal players by the hundreds of thousands. But the survivors, the large, well-capitalized carriers like J.B. Hunt, are now benefiting from tighter capacity and slightly improved demand. They have more pricing power, more load volume, and the resources to weather the storm and take advantage of any recovery. This signals that the largest carriers are beginning to benefit from the market consolidation. Their smaller competitors who could not survive the 4 years have already exited the market completely. This handed the survivors much more of the available load volume. Imagine being J.B. Hunt in spring 2026. Your profits are surging 20%. The future looks brighter. The competitive landscape has been simplified by the elimination of thousands of smaller competitors. Now imagine being an owner-operator who exited the market and lost everything. You are watching the market recover while you are not part of it anymore. The twist is that the market will recover, but it will be a completely different market. Smaller, more consolidated, and dominated by large carriers. The trucking industry will never go back to the fragmentation of 2022. The small carriers are gone, and many will not come back. This is not just recovery. This is a rebirth into a new industry structure. The critical question that remains is 2026 actually the beginning of real recovery, or just a brief pause before more decline hits the industry? Industry analysts are very careful about how they describe 2026. They call it a transition year, not a rebound year. Conditions are improving in the right direction, but recovery has not been fully established yet. Spot rates are moving upwards slowly from their devastating lows. Capacity is tighter than it was. Compliance is improving thanks to the regulatory crackdowns, but rates still have not returned to levels that would restore carrier profitability and justify buying new equipment. The market is moving forward, but the pace is slow, tentative, and depends on factors outside the industry's control. Think about being a carrier that survived 4 years of devastating losses. You are seeing rates move upward slightly, and you feel a tiny bit of hope, but you are also extremely cautious because you have been disappointed so many times before. You do not dare believe recovery is really coming because false hope has cost you so much already. Here is the ultimate truth about the truck market crash that nobody wants to admit. The truck market did not crash in one dramatic moment, like people imagine crashes happen. It spent 4 years slowly grinding its most vulnerable participants into complete insolvency. So we started by asking, is the truck market about to crash? The answer is no, it already crashed. The real question now is, can the survivors rebuild? And the answer, tentatively, is yes, but it will be a different market. Smaller, more consolidated, with fewer opportunities for small players and more power for large carriers. That is the future of trucking that 2026 is revealing. The industry that once had room for thousands of small operators now has room only for a few hundred large ones. The drivers who thrived in 2022 are mostly gone. The companies that survived are the ones with deep pockets and patience. The equipment market is slowly starting to move again, not because demand is strong, but because regulation is forcing upgrades. And the most remarkable thing is that most people outside the industry have no idea any of this happened. They just see slightly higher shipping costs and wonder why. But in every truck you see on the highway, there is a story. A driver who survived, a company that made hard choices, a network of families and communities that were transformed by a market they could not control and did not see coming. If you work in trucking or your family depends on this industry, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You lived from 2022 to 2025. You watched people you know lose everything. You made impossible choices. You probably still carry the weight of the decisions you had to make. You know what it feels like to watch your life's investment disappear in months. You understand the pressure of keeping a business alive when the math does not work. Thank you for watching this. You deserve to have your story told. You deserve to have your reality acknowledged. Like and subscribe so you never miss another investigation into what is really happening in the industries that shape your life. Share this with someone who works in trucking or knows someone who does. And comment below, do you work in trucking? Have you experienced this freight recession firsthand? Are you hopeful about the 2026 recovery? Are you still waiting for rates to get better? Will the EPA 2027 regulations actually restart the equipment market? Share your real experience, because both the data and the human stories matter. The numbers tell us what happened. Your stories tell us what it meant.